The story begins with the girl running, her breath torn from her lungs in white clouds that hung in the air before vanishing into the storm. The prairie was a vast, frozen wasteland, the ground swallowed by thick snow that reached almost to her knees. Her boots, already cracked and worn thin, filled with ice water each time she stumbled forward. But she did not stop. Stopping meant death. The ranch she had fled was miles behind her now, but its shadow clung to her as surely as the frost that bit her skin. She could still feel the iron grip of her captor, the rancher who had treated her less like a woman and more like property to be owned, used, and discarded. His cabin walls had been prison bars, his fists reminders of her place. But when the snow came heavy and the men grew drunk by the fire, she had seen her chance. She had stolen away, barefoot, at first clutching only a blanket she had snatched from the bed. That was 2 days ago. The blanket was gone now, dropped somewhere in the drifts when her hands became too numb to hold it. Her face was raw from the icy wind, her lips cracked until they bled. The storm clawed at her like a living thing, howling in her ears, drowning out even her thoughts. The world was endless white, sky and earth blending into one, a cruel trap that turned her around until she no longer knew where she walked. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but thirst was worse. Snow she chewed only made her teeth ache and froze her tongue. She thought more than once of lying down. The snowbanks looked soft, inviting almost, a place to rest her weary bones. Many had, frozen that way, slipping into sleep as the cold crept deeper, then never waking. Each time her knees buckled, she told herself the same thing. Not yet. Not until you are free. She had not endured beatings, humiliation, and terror, only to surrender. Now, somewhere ahead there had to be a place the rancher's men would not follow. But night was coming. The pale light of the winter sun sank low, and with it her strength. Shadows stretched across the endless whiteness, and the cold seemed to double with each passing moment. Her fingers no longer obeyed her. They had turned white, stiff, claw-like. She pressed them under her arms, trying to draw heat from her own body, but there was little warmth left to give. The sound of wolves carried through the storm, a long, thin howl that pierced the blizzard. Her blood ran colder. Wolves hunted the weak, and she was as weak as prey came. She stumbled faster, though every step sent knives of pain up her frozen legs. Then, just when her sight began to blur, she saw it, a dark shape in the snow. At first, she thought it was another wolf. She froze, heart hammering. The figure stood still against the whiteness, tall and broad, wrapped in furs. As the wind parted for a heartbeat, she saw his face, strong, stern, bronze skin framed by black hair braided and tied. His eyes were sharp, not dulled like the men she had fled, an Apache. Her heart stumbled. The rancher had warned her of them, savages, he had said, crueler than the cold itself. But standing there, she wondered if he had been wrong. This man was not wild like the storm. He was controlled, every line of him shaped by strength. He looked at her as though weighing whether she was ghost, prey, or intruder. His hand rested on the bow slung across his shoulder, but he did not draw it. The girl opened her mouth, but only a croak came. Her voice was nearly gone from the cold. She tried again, whispering, "Please." The Apache's gaze flicked over her trembling frame, her frost-bitten fingers, her broken boots. He could see what she was, dying, alone. Yet he did not step forward, not yet. His voice, low and steady, cut through the wind. "Why do you walk the snow without fire?" The word struck her like a whip of clarity. She almost fell to her knees, weeping, though no tears would come in the frozen air. She had found someone who spoke, someone alive, someone who might, just might, keep her from vanishing into the storm. But at what cost? The man did not move at once. He stood as solid as the pine trees buried in snow behind him, wrapped in a cloak of animal furs. His black eyes, sharp and watchful, measured the trembling figure before him. She was half broken already, skin pale, lips cracked with blood, hair stiff with frost. By rights, she should have been dead. No one survived long in such weather without fire or food. Yet here she was, swaying on her feet, clinging to life with sheer desperation. He lowered his bow, though his fingers did not leave it. He did not trust easily, and he had every reason not to. His people were hunted, driven from their lands, starved in the cold moons, ambushed whenever they strayed too near the white man's settlements. The woman before him wore the face of those enemies. But she was no warrior. She had no rifle, no knife. She was as helpless as a fawn in the snow. Her voice broke through the storm again, ragged, thin as wind. Please. Help. The Apache's breath rose in white clouds as he stepped closer, boots crunching through the crusted snow. Up close, the woman seemed even more fragile, as though one push might shatter her into pieces. He studied her hands, blotched and stiff, the skin turning black at the tips. Her body shivered violently. If he left her here, she would be dead before the next moonrise. Still, suspicion tugged at him. Why was she here, wandering alone in the storm? White women did not roam these hunting grounds without reason. Perhaps she was bait, left to lure him close while armed men waited in the trees. He glanced around the ridgeline, eyes narrowing, scanning the blowing snow for movement, but the world was empty. Only wolves howled far off, their cries long and mournful. If there were men, they would not last long in this storm. The girl swayed, her knees giving way, and collapsed into the snow with a muffled cry. He knelt beside her, pulling her upright before the frost could claim her. Her head lolled against his chest, her eyes rolling back. He could feel the chill of her body even through his furs. She had no warmth left to give herself. Get up, he ordered, his voice flat but firm, or the snow will eat you. Her eyelids fluttered open. She saw him clearly for the first time, his strong jaw, his high cheekbones, his long braid, laced with rawhide. Fear flickered in her gaze. She had heard the same stories all white folk had. Apaches slit throats, Apaches scalped, Apaches burned captives alive. Yet here he was, holding her steady instead of letting her die. I can't, she whispered, her teeth chattering so violently the words barely formed. He studied her for a long breath, then exhaled slowly, a cloud vanishing into the wind. If he let her fall, she would be another nameless corpse in the drifts. He had seen too many of those already. The spirits of the dead were heavy enough without another added to their weight. With a grunt, he lifted her into his arms. She was light as kindling, bones wrapped in thin flesh. He could feel the rattle of her breath against him as he started toward the shelter he had built in the trees. The storm thickened, stinging his face with ice. He carried her steadily, each step measured, his moccasins sinking deep. Snowflakes tangled in her hair and dusted his shoulders. She clung weakly to him, her head tucked against his chest as if some part of her still fought against death. By the time he reached the pine grove, her eyes had slipped closed. His lodge stood hidden beneath the trees built of poles and hides, smoke curling faintly from a small hole in the roof. He ducked inside, the sudden stillness of the space wrapping around them. The air smelled of wood smoke and tanned hides, warmth compared to the endless howl outside. He set her down beside the fire pit, where embers glowed faintly. Her skin was chalk white, lips blue. He threw fresh wood on the fire, coaxing it to life, until flames licked upward, casting a warm glow across the lodge walls. The woman stirred, moaning softly. Her eyes cracked open, catching the flicker of firelight. For the first time in days, she felt heat on her frozen skin. She looked at him, confusion mingling with gratitude and fear. He crouched across from her, dark eyes fixed. His voice was calm but carried weight, the kind of tone that demanded an answer. Why do you wander the winter land alone? Speak truth. She swallowed hard, throat raw. The storm outside screamed against the hides of the lodge, but inside, silence stretched. Between them, finally, her voice, faint as a whisper of wind. I ran from the rancher. If I stayed, he would have killed me. Or worse. The Apache said nothing for a long while. He only stared into the fire, his jaw set, his thoughts hidden. The flames crackled between them, throwing shadows on the lodge walls. At last he looked at her again. His words were measured, deliberate, each one striking like a hammer. You need shelter and I need a wife. The fire popped. The storm roared. Her heart pounded in her chest. She did not yet understand the full meaning of his words, but she knew at once that the storm outside was no longer the most dangerous thing in her world. The flames cast long, trembling shadows across the lodge walls. The woman sat huddled close to the fire, her hands stretched toward the warmth. Even so, her fingers barely moved, stiff from frostbite. Pain shot through her arms as blood began to flow again, but she bore it without sound. She was too exhausted for tears. The Apache crouched across from her. His cloak of furs pooled around him, his face unreadable as he watched her. His silence was heavier than the storm outside. She could feel his eyes on her, weighing her like a man judging whether a fallen horse was worth the trouble of lifting. She finally broke the silence. If you hadn't found me," her voice cracked. She swallowed and tried again. "I would have died out there." He did not nod, nor did his expression soften. He simply stirred the fire with a stick, embers sparking up like tiny stars. His voice was low, rough from years of command. "You already carried death on your back. The snow would have finished what your enemies began." Her chest tightened. She looked down at her raw hands. "My enemies." She hesitated. "They won't stop. The rancher, he'll send men. He always does. I've run before. This time I thought I could make it farther. But..." She gestured toward the hides that formed the lodge walls. "I didn't know I'd walk into your land." His eyes glinted in the firelight. "You are far past the white man's fences. Few dare step here. But you did. And now you breathe because of me." She nodded weakly, though fear coiled inside her. What would he ask for in return? No man gave shelter freely. The rancher had taught her that bitter lesson too well. The Apache leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze locked on her. "My people tell me, take another wife, strengthen your lodge, fill the winter with life again." But I did not listen. His tone grew heavier. "Until now." Her breath caught. "Wife?" The word felt foreign in her mouth, sharper than the wind outside. "You need shelter," he said, his voice firm, certain, "and I need a wife." The fire cracked, sending a spray of sparks into the smoke hole above. For a long moment, only the storm howled outside. She stared at him, heart pounding. To be his wife? She hardly knew him. He was Apache, a man her people called savage, though nothing in his eyes seemed savage now. Still, the word wife carried a weight she wasn't ready to bear. Had she escaped one man's chains only to step into another's? Her hands twisted in her lap. "If I say no?" His expression did not change. He looked into the fire, then back to her. "Then the snow will take you before sunrise. I will not keep alive one who refuses to live under my roof." The bluntness of his words struck harder than any blow. He wasn't threatening to kill her. He was simply stating fact. Without him, without fire, food, and shelter, she was finished. She knew it as well as he did. Her throat tightened. She thought of the rancher's cruel hands, the long nights of pain and fear. She thought of the storm waiting outside, cold as a grave. And then she thought of this man, silent, stern, but alive, warm, and strong enough to keep both the storm and the rancher's men at bay. She lowered her head, her voice shook, but the words left her lips all the same. "I agree." The Apache's dark eyes studied her carefully, searching for lies. At last, he gave a single firm nod. "Then, you are mine, from this night forward." The firelight flickered over their faces, hers pale and frightened, his solemn and unyielding. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the lodge, a pact was made, not one born of love, but of survival, a pact that would change everything. The night dragged long, the storm thrashing against the lodge walls as though the world itself wanted to claw its way inside. The woman lay wrapped in furs, but sleep did not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the rancher's face, twisted with rage, his fists raised. Then she saw the Apache's face, stern, unreadable. When he had spoken the words, "You need shelter, and I need a wife." The pact weighed on her like a stone. She had agreed, but what did agreement mean in this place among these people? Would he demand her obedience, her body, her silence, the same way the rancher had? She pulled the fur tighter around herself and stared at the fire until her eyes burned. Morning came slow, gray light seeping through the cracks of the lodge. The fire had burned low, but the Apache was already awake. He stood outside, brushing snow from his shoulders, his breath rising in steady plumes. He moved with the quiet strength of a wolf, controlled, certain, every motion necessary. When he stepped back inside, he met her gaze. His words were few. "Eat." He placed a strip of dried venison in her hand. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but her hand shook as she brought it to her mouth. The meat was tough, salty, but it filled her belly with something other than fear for the first time in days. "You will work," he said after a while, sitting by the fire. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "No one in this lodge sits idle. You will carry water, tend fire, mend hides. My people will see if you are strong, or if you are only burden." She flinched at the word. Burden. She had been called that before, spat at and beaten for being useless. But the way he said it was different, not cruelty but truth. In his world, survival demanded labor. There was no room for weakness. Her eyes met his, still fearful, but steady. "And if I fail, then the snow will bury you." His tone never wavered. "But if you do not fail, you will live, and you will live as my wife." The word burned in her ears again. She still did not know what it meant here, among his people, under his laws, but she knew this much. If she refused, she would be dead before another sunrise. She nodded slowly, her throat tight. "I'll work." Something flickered in his eyes. Not kindness, not warmth, but the faintest glimmer of respect. He rose, adjusting the furs on his shoulders, and gestured toward the door. "Then you begin now." The cold slammed against her when she stepped outside. Snow stretched in all directions, the trees heavy with white. The sky was iron gray, promising more storms. She shivered violently but forced her feet to move, following his instructions as he showed her how to haul water from the frozen stream, how to split wood with numb hands, how to keep the fire from dying. By midday, her body ached, but she was still standing, still breathing, still alive. And though she would not yet admit it to herself, something inside her had shifted. The rancher had made her feel like a prisoner. The storm had made her feel like prey. But here, in this harsh and frozen place, beneath the gaze of a man who demanded much but promised survival, she felt something new, like perhaps she was not entirely helpless after all. The pact was made. The choice was done. The snow no longer seemed as eager to claim her as it had the night before. The lodge stood firm against the storm, its hides stretched tight over poles, smoke curling faintly from the roof hole. Inside, the fire kept them alive, but outside, the world remained a white wilderness. Days blurred into one another, each marked by labor, survival, and silence. The woman quickly learned that life in the Apache winter camp was not a gift freely given. Survival demanded a price, and she would pay it with her hands, her back, her endurance. The Apache warrior rose at dawn each day, his movements quiet, purposeful. He cut wood, hunted in the drifts, checked traps, and disappeared into the snow, for hours at a time. When he returned, it was always with something: meat from a rabbit snared, wood to keep the fire strong, hides to patch the walls of the lodge. He never wasted words and rarely looked at her for long. But when he gave her a task, his dark eyes made it clear. Failure was not an option. Her first burden was the fire. Without it, the lodge would be no warmer than a grave. She gathered wood as he showed her, dragging frozen branches from beneath, heavy drifts, her fingers stiff, her arms aching. At first she fumbled with the flint, her numb hands unable to coax a spark. He watched once, silent, then took the stones from her and struck them himself, flames catching in dry moss. He handed them back, his jaw set. "You learn, or you die." The words stung, but they lit a fire inside her just as fierce as the one on the hearth. She learned. Slowly, painfully, she learned. Her second burden was water. Each day she carried buckets to the stream that ran sluggish beneath a crust of ice. She hacked holes through the frozen skin with a hatchet, her breath white and ragged. She filled buckets until her arms burned, stumbling back to the lodge with knees trembling. She had once thought the rancher's chores endless, cruel. But here, under the pines, every drop of water, every stick of wood, every spark of fire, meant the difference between living and dying. When the Apache warrior took her into the main camp, the stairs burned worse than the wind. Dozens of eyes followed her, sharp and unkind. Apache women looked at her with suspicion, their lips tight, their whispers sharp. Men watched too, their expressions unreadable. To them, she was a trespasser, a pale intruder in their winter world. One woman, older, with braids streaked with gray, stopped in front of her. She pointed at the girl's pale hands clutching the water bucket and spat words in Apache. Though the woman could not understand them, she understood the tone well enough. Useless, outsider, burden. She lowered her eyes and kept walking. But inside, shame burned. She wanted to prove them wrong. That night, when the warrior returned from hunting, he found her still working by firelight, sewing torn hide with fingers raw and bleeding. She did not see him at first, watching from the doorway. For the first time, he looked at her not as a dying stranger, but as a woman who refused to surrender. He said nothing, but when she finished, he examined the stitches. They were crooked, uneven but strong. He gave a single nod. Better. It was the first word of approval he had given her. And though it was small, it felt like a mountain had shifted. Her days grew into a rhythm. She fetched water, tended fire, sewed hides, ground frozen corn with aching arms. Nights she collapsed by the hearth, too tired to speak, too tired even to fear. And slowly, bit by bit, she felt the numbness inside her thaw, not just from the fire, but from the knowledge that she was surviving. The storm still howled outside, the snow still sought to bury her. But in the lodge among the Apaches, she was no longer a helpless fugitive. She was a woman fighting to live. And with every day she endured, she became harder, sharper, more alive than she had ever been before. Trust did not come easy in the winter camp. Every glance from the Apache women was a blade, every whisper a wound. They did not want her there. She was pale-faced, weak, a mouth to feed when there was barely enough to go around. At first, she bore the suspicion in silence. She did her chores, kept her head low, and spoke only when spoken to. But fate has a way of testing those who wish to remain unseen. The first trial came with the children. They played near the edge of camp, chasing each other through the snow, their laughter bright against the gray sky. She watched them from a distance, her heart aching with memories of a childhood long gone. Then suddenly one of the smaller boys slipped, tumbling down a drift where a rattlesnake had burrowed beneath the snow. The snake struck, quick as lightning, sinking its fangs into the boy's arm. The camp erupted in panic. The women screamed, rushing toward the child. But the girl did not think. She acted. She dropped her water bucket and ran, scooping the boy into her arms. She pressed his wound, holding it high, her voice sharp. "He'll die if you wait. Heat. Fire." Her words were in English, but her intent was clear. She shoved snow into the wound to slow the poison, then carried him toward the lodge fire. The warrior appeared, his eyes narrowing as he saw her cradling the boy. For a heartbeat, he almost pulled her back. But then he saw the boy's pale face, his arm swelling fast. Together, they worked. She tended the wound. He chanted prayers to the spirits, cutting shallow lines to draw out the venom. The boy lived. His breathing steadied, his eyes fluttered open. For the first time, the camp did not look at her with suspicion, but with something else. Not warmth, not yet, but something closer to respect. The second trial came weeks later, when the men returned. From a raid. Some were wounded, bleeding from gunshot and blade. She did not wait to be told. She tore strips of hide for bandages, boiled snow for water, and knelt beside the injured. Her hands shook, but she pressed them to wounds, tied strips tight, whispered calm words to men who had never heard her tongue before. The warrior watched from the shadows, his arms crossed. He had not asked this of her. Yet she did it anyway. And when the wounded men slept, their wounds bound, he looked at her differently. No longer as a fragile burden, but as a woman whose spirit burned as fiercely as the fire in their lodge. That night, when the camp grew quiet and the snow fell heavy, he spoke to her at last. His words were simple but heavy with meaning. You do not fear death. She looked into the flames, her face lit by their glow. I've lived too close to it to fear it anymore. For the first time, he allowed himself the smallest curve of a smile, quick, fleeting, but real. And in that moment, the wall between them, built from suspicion and silence, began to crack. Trust, fragile as a new flame, had begun to grow. Winter's grip tightened with every passing day. Snow fell heavier, the winds sharper, until the land itself seemed determined to bury every living thing beneath ice and silence. Yet life in the Apache camp pressed on. Fires burned, hunters brought meat, women sewed hides, children laughed between storms. For a time, the woman almost believed she had outrun the past. But shadows always follow. It began with tracks. One morning, the Apache warrior returned from hunting later than usual. His jaw was tight, his eyes darker than the storm clouds overhead. He said nothing at first, only set his bow against the wall and crouched by the fire. She could sense the weight in him. The air was thick, his silence more telling than words. Finally, she asked softly, "What is it?" His gaze met hers, sharp as a blade. "Horse prints. 5. White men. Close." Her heart dropped. For a moment, she could not breathe. She knew without asking whose men they were. The rancher had sent riders, just as he always did. His pride would not allow her escape. Not to the snow, not to the wilderness, not even into Apache land. The warrior continued, his voice low but steady. They circle, they search. They follow the storm, but storms end. When they do, they will find us. The lodge felt colder despite the fire. She pulled the fur tighter around her shoulders, but it could not stop the fear that crept into her bones. The Apache stood, his frame tall and unyielding against the glow of the fire. My people will not run. We do not hide from men who think us prey. But you, he paused, his eyes narrowing. This is your enemy, your shadow. You brought it here. The words stung, though he spoke truth. She lowered her eyes. Shame, pressing down like snow on branches. I didn't mean... He cut her off with a raised hand. Meaning does not change what is. Silence stretched long. The fire popped, sparks flying up the smoke hole. At last, she forced herself to meet his gaze. What will you do? What I must. His tone carried no hesitation. If they come, we fight. The word fight sent a shiver through her. She had seen enough blood, enough cruelty to know what it meant. The rancher's men were armed with rifles, used to killing, and yet, when she looked at the Apache warrior painted in firelight, she did not doubt him. He was forged for battle, steady as the mountain itself. That night, the camp prepared. Men sharpened blades and checked arrows, their faces hard as stone. Women gathered children, whispered prayers, and fed the fires to burn hotter. The warrior painted his face with ash and red clay, lines that made his features sharper, fiercer. When she saw him, her breath caught. He looked like a spirit risen from the storm, terrible, beautiful, unbreakable. But when his eyes met hers, they softened for only a heartbeat. He stepped close, his voice a low rumble. The men who come, they will try to take you. They will not ask. They will not beg. They will tear you from here if they can. You must choose now, run before they arrive, or stay and fight beside me. The storm howled outside, a wolf's cry across the endless snow. Inside, her heart beat like a drum. Run or stay. The warrior's words echoed long into the night. Run, stay, choose. The woman lay awake on her bed of hides, staring into the flames as they danced and flickered. The storm battered the lodge walls, but her thoughts were louder still. She had fled the rancher once. She could flee again, slip into the snow, vanish while the Apache defended their camp. It would be the safer choice, the selfish choice, the choice she had always been forced into. But her mind returned to the boy she had saved from the snakebite, to the wounded warriors whose blood she had staunched with her trembling hands, to the fire she had kept alive when everyone else slept. These people had doubted her, hated her even, and yet they had let her stay. And then there was him, the Apache. He had found her half dead in the snow and lifted her when she could not walk. He had demanded much, but never cruelty. His words had been hard, but they had carried truth, not malice. His eyes, dark, unyielding, had seen her at her weakest and had not turned away. She turned her face toward him where he slept near the doorway, his bow within reach, his chest rising slow and steady beneath his furs. She thought of the rancher's hands, rough and merciless. Then she thought of his hands, steady, calloused, strong enough to protect rather than destroy. Her throat tightened. The rancher would drag her back to chains. The storm would bury her in silence. But here, with him, there was something different. Hard, yes. Demanding, yes. But not chains, not cruelty. Something else she could not yet name. The decision came, not with thunder but with quiet certainty, like the slow lighting of dawn. She would not run. The next morning, when he rose to paint his face for war, she stood waiting. Her hair was braided back roughly, her body wrapped in furs, a knife tucked into her belt. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes narrowing. "You will flee with the women and children," he said flatly. "No." Her voice was stronger than she expected. She met his gaze without flinching. "I stay." His brow furrowed. "This is not your fight." "Yes, it is." She stepped closer, her chin lifting though her heart pounded. "They came for me. I won't run again. Not this time." For a long, tense moment, he said nothing. His dark eyes searched her face, looking for weakness, for fear. And though her hands trembled, she did not break. At last, his expression shifted. The faintest spark of something, respect, pride, maybe even admiration, flickered there. He leaned close, his voice low. "Then stay. Stay as my wife. Stand with me." The word, wife, no longer felt like chains around her neck. It felt like a vow. She nodded once, firm. "I will." And in that moment, the storm outside seemed quieter, the snow less cold. For the first time since she had fled, she felt not hunted, not broken, but strong. Strong, because she had chosen. She had chosen to fight. She had chosen him. And though the battle had not yet come, the pact they had made that night was stronger than the storm itself. The storm broke with a sky clear and bitter cold, the kind of day when sound carried sharp across the frozen land. The snow glittered hard as glass, and in the silence, the camp felt strung tight, like a bow waiting to snap. They came at dawn. 5. Riders cresting the ridge, rifles slung across their shoulders, horses snorting steam in the cold. White men, the rancher's men. She recognized them even before they rode close. The rancher's cruelty had its stamp on their faces. Hard, greedy, the kind of men who didn't come to talk. The Apache camp stirred quickly. Men took their bows. Women pulled children behind lodges, and the warrior stood at the front, his bow already strung. His face was painted in streaks of red and black, a mask of war. At his side she stood, her fur cloak heavy around her shoulders, her knife gripped. Tight, the riders halted a stone's throw from the camp. The leader, a broad man with a scar across his cheek, called out in English, "We've come for what's ours. Send the woman out, and we'll leave you in peace." His words cut her like knives. What's ours? As if she were a horse, a thing, to be taken back in chains. The Apache warrior answered in his own tongue, fierce and sharp, his voice carrying across the snow. She could not understand the words, but the meaning was clear. She is mine now. She is not yours to claim. The scar-faced rider spat into the snow. Then we'll take her by force. He raised his rifle. The first shot cracked the air. Chaos erupted. Arrows hissed, rifles thundered, the camp filled with the screams of men and horses. Smoke curled in the icy air, sharp against the snow's purity. She ducked low, heart pounding, as a bullet tore through the lodge behind her. The warrior loosed arrow after arrow, his movement swift, deadly. One rider fell with a cry, clutching his chest. Another's horse screamed, rearing and throwing its rider into the drifts. She found herself beside a wounded Apache man, blood spilling from his shoulder. Without thinking, she pressed her cloak against the wound, her knife still clutched in her other hand. A rider charged close, his eyes wild, and she froze, until the warrior's arrow struck him clean through the throat, toppling him from his saddle. The fight raged, brutal and quick. The snow turned red, horses scattered, men fell. The scar-faced leader fought hardest, firing again and again, his eyes locked on her. When his last bullet missed, he roared and charged on foot, a knife gleaming in his hand. She stumbled back, fear surging hot, until she felt the warrior's arm shove her aside. The two men collided in the snow, steel flashing, breath clouding the air. They grappled, knives clashing, bodies straining with raw fury. For a moment it seemed the scar-faced man had the upper hand, driving his blade toward the Apache's chest. But then, she moved. With trembling hands, she seized the knife from her belt and drove it forward, striking the scar-faced man in the side. His eyes went wide with shock, his body stiffening before he collapsed into the snow. Silence fell, broken only by the wind. The rancher's men lay scattered, dead or fleeing into the trees. The camp stood shaken but alive. She stood trembling, blood on her hands, the knife slipping from her fingers. The warrior rose slowly, his breath heavy, his dark eyes locking on hers. For a long moment they only stared at each other. Then without a word he reached out and took her hand, not in chains, not in command, but in something fierce and binding. Together, they had won. After the battle, the camp was quiet. Too quiet. The dead were carried away. Fires burned low and prayers were whispered into the night sky. The snow had covered much of the blood by morning, but not all. Some stains do not vanish so easily. She sat by the fire, her hands raw, her body trembling still from the memory of what she had done. The knife. The man's eyes as life fled him. She had never killed before. The weight of it pressed on her chest like a stone. The warrior approached, silent as always. He crouched beside her, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "You fought," he said simply. Her throat tightened. "I killed." His gaze was steady, unflinching. "You lived." The words struck deep, easing something in her chest. She met his eyes, and for the first time she saw not only the hardness of a warrior, but the warmth of a man who had chosen her as much as she had chosen him. Days passed, the storm breaking into clearer skies. Life in the camp returned to rhythm, though forever changed. The people looked at her differently now, no longer with suspicion or scorn, but with the quiet acknowledgement of one who had proven herself. Some even nodded to her in passing, a gesture she never thought she'd see. She worked harder than ever, fetching water, tending wounds, mending hides. And at night, when the fire burned low, she and the warrior shared a silence that felt less empty than before. Not words, but something stronger. Trust. One night, as the moon hung bright over the snow, he finally spoke the vow she had long felt but never heard. "You are no longer a fugitive," he said softly, his hand brushing her cheek. "You are my wife. My people will know you as such. The storm brought you here. Now you belong here." Her eyes stung with tears, but she did not look away. For so long she had been hunted, chained, beaten down. But here, in the bitter cold of winter, she had found something she never thought possible: freedom, belonging, and a man who saw her not as a possession, but as a partner. The winter passed slowly, but not unbearably. Each day brought new trials, but she faced them not with fear, but with the quiet strength she had learned in the storm. Together they built something new, hard-won, fragile, but real. And when the spring thaw finally came, melting the snow into rivers and bringing green back to the land, she walked through the camp not as an outsider, but as a woman reborn. The storm had tested her. The battle had scarred her. But the pact she had made, the vow of shelter for the promise of a wife, had given her more than survival. It had given her a home. And in the heart of the Apache warrior, she had found not chains, but love.